Hey y'all, content warnings for this week are massive sexism in this chapter, and also the doctor doing that thing where they refuse to listen to a patient, but there could really be something wrong, so that could be triggering for some people. Alright, please enjoy. Sin and Space Chapter 15. Hell of a day it was. It started, for one thing, with a hangover. Tony heaved himself out of bed, glad to find Graham still asleep. He didn't want any cheerful conversation just yet. He prescribed, dispensed, and self-administered some aspirin, used an extra cup of water for a second cup of coffee, finally decided he was strong enough to face the reek of methanol alcohol, and got washed. Mimi Johnson was in charge at the lab when he got there. Law or no law, he raced through the AM lab check to get ahead of the awful job of monitoring the unpacking operation. He rode out on a bike to the 5 spots Stillman had selected for the inspection cruise, and found them reasonably low in radioactivity. Sheets of plastic had been laid down for flooring, and tent walls were going up, with little tunnels through which the crates could be passed without the handlers bringing in the dust of Mars on their feet. Blowers were rigged to change the air between each inspection, and radiologically clean overalls would be passed in at the same time. A little after dawn, the careful frenzy was in full swing. A crew in the shipping room eased out crates and passed them for wrappers, who covered them with plastic sheeting and heat-sealed them. Aboard skids, the crates were manhandled up the slight slope from the canal bed to the tents in the desert, unwrapped, passed in, opened, searched, checked for chemical and radiological contamination, sealed, and passed out again. Back at the lab, they would be wrapped in lead sheets pending recrating and stored separately in every workroom that could be spared. Mimi was everywhere, ordering a speed-up on the heat sealing or a slowdown on the bucket brigade manhandling, routing crates to the station that would soonest be free, demanding more plastic sheeting, drafting a woman to wash more coveralls when a stand of them toppled over. The few lab processes that couldn't be left alone were tended under the direction of Sam Flexner, by people from agro and administration, and by specialized workers like Anna Willendorf. Tony and Harv Stillman moved constantly up and down the line, back to the lab and out to the desert, checking persons, places, and materials. Before noon, Tony had the bitter job of telling Mimi, "I've got to abandon the number 2 tent. It's warming up. Radioactivity is low in the site, but it's from something that chains with the plastic flooring. I don't know what. Another hour and radiation from the flooring will contaminate the crates." The woman set her jaw and picked another crew from the line to set up a tent on another monitored site. Somebody slipped in the number 3 tent, and Harv Stillman found some of the Leukemia Foundation's shipment of radiophosphorus had gotten from the inside of the crate to the outside, enough to warrant refusal by the rocket supercargo in the interests of safety of the ship. But never a trace of Marcane did the search crews find. Lunch was at noon, carried about by colony children. Gulping cool coffee, Tony told Harv Stillman, "You'll have to take it alone for a while. I haven't visited my patients yet. I missed Joan Radcliffe altogether yesterday." "Hell, I still don't know whether I'm coming or going," grunted Stillman, then added, "I guess I can manage. Send for me if there's anything you really can't handle." Tony started back towards the street of huts before a new emergency could delay him. He stopped at his own house to pick up his medical bag, and found Graham awake, at work in front of an old-fashioned portable typewriter. Another surprise from the Gunther. Tony had assumed the man worked with a dictatyper. Even in the colony they had those. Graham looked up pleasantly and nodded. "Somebody waiting for you in the other room, Tony." He motioned with his head toward the door that led to the hospital. "Going out again?" The doctor nodded. "I don't know when I'll get back. You can walk around and ask questions wherever you find anybody. You understand the situation here. We can't let up on this Marcane business even for the press." "Sure." The Gunther nodded, unperturbed. "I'll get around in time to pick you up for supper anyhow," Tony promised. "Did you get any lunch?" "I managed." Graham grinned and pointed to an open can still half full of meat and a box of hard crackers. "Look," said the writer, "unless you've lost your Earthside taste completely, why don't you have supper on me tonight? There's lots more where lunch came from." "Thanks, I might take you up on that." Tony went into the hospital, where Edgar Kroll was waiting for him. "Sorry to bother you today, Doc," Kroll apologized. "Came over on the chance you'd be around right now. Another of those damn headaches. I can't get any work done at all this morning. Guess I'm just getting old." "Old?" Tony snorted. "Man, even in Sun Lake you're not old at 35. Not just because you need bifocals. You've stalled around long enough now." And heaven only knew what bawdor tauntings from young Jane Kroll lay behind, Tony thought, as he reached into the dispensary cabinet. "Here's some aspirin for now. If you come around tomorrow, I think I'll have time to refract you. I just can't manage it today. Take the afternoon off, if the headache doesn't go away." He got his black bag and walked down the street with Edgar, as far as the Candros' place. At the door, he bumped into Jim, just leaving for the lab after lunch. "Glad I saw you, Doc." The new father stood hesitantly in the doorway, waiting till Kroll was out of earshot, then burst out, "Listen, Tony, I didn't want to say anything in front of Polly, but are you sure it's going to be all right? Sonny still isn't eating. Maybe it's cancer or something. I heard of something like that with one of our neighbor's kids back in Toledo." Just exactly the sort of thing that made Tony almost blind with rage. He liked the man. Jim Candro was his brother, his comrade in the colony, but with his pulse hammering, he made it clear to Jim in a few icy sentences that he had studied long, sacrificed much, and worked hard to learn what he could about medicine, and that when he wanted a snap diagnosis from a layman, he would ask for one. Jim and Polly could yank him out of bed at 3 in the morning. They could make him minister to their natural anxieties, but they could not make him take such an insult. He stalked into the house, ignoring Jim's protests and apologies both, and professional habit took over him as he greeted Polly and examined the baby. "About time for feeding, isn't it?" he asked. "Is it going any better? Since last night, I mean. Want to try him while I observe?" "That's a little better, I guess." Polly smiled doubtfully and picked up the baby. She moved the plastic cup of the oxygen mask up a little over the small nose and put Sonny to her breast. To Tony, it was plain that the infant was frantic with hunger. Then why didn't it nurse properly? Instead of closing over the nipple, Sonny's mouth pushed at it one-sidedly, first to the right, then to the left, any way but the proper way. For seconds at a time, the baby did suck, then it would release the nipple, choking. "He's doing a little better," said Polly. "He's doing much better." "That's fine," Tony agreed feebly. "I'll be on my way then. Be sure to call me if there's anything." He walked down the colony street, wishing a doctor could afford the luxury of shaking his head in bewilderment. Maybe it was all straightening out. But what would account for the infant's fantastic behavior? There was nothing so determined as a baby wanting to feed, but something was getting in the way of Sonny's instinct. He hoped Polly realized that Sonny would feed sooner or later, that the choking reflex which frustrated the sucking reflex would disappear before long. He hoped she would realize it. He hoped desperately that it would happen. Joan Radcliffe was next, and this time he found her awake. She was no better and no worse. The enigmatic course of her nameless disease had leveled off. All he could do was talk a while, go through the pulse-taking and temperature-reading mumbo-jumbo, change the dressings on her sores, talk some more, then go out. Now Dorothy, the sinus case, and he was done with his more serious cases for today. Tanya Biles had a green sick card on her door, but he decided to ignore it. He was already past the house when she called his name, and he turned to find her beckoning from the open door. She had dressed up to beat the band, an absurdly tight tunic to show off her passable 30-plus figure, carefully done hair, and the first lipstick he remembered seeing around in months. "I don't have much time today, Mrs. Biles," he said carefully. "Could it wait until tomorrow?" "Oh, please, doctor," she begged, and launched into a typical hypochondriac resume of symptoms, complete with medical terms inaccurately used. What it boiled down to was that a thorough examination was in order, though there was nothing nasty wrong with her. "Very well," he said. "If you'll come over to the hospital, next week, perhaps, when I have more time. With a chaperone," he added silently. "Wouldn't it be just as easy here, and more private?" she ventured shyly, indicating the bedroom, where a heat lamp was already focused on the made bed. "Dear God," he muttered, and found the professional restraint that had taken over while he was with Polly Condro had now quite abandoned him. "Mrs. Biles," he said plainly and nastily, "you may not realize it, but we do have a sense of humor here, even if we don't share your ideas of fun. We've been able to laugh off your malicious gossiping and the lousy job you do in agronomy. You do get some work done in agro, and you don't eat too much to keep your shape. Up till now, we've been able to laugh everything off and hope you'd straighten out. But I warn you, if you start being seductive around Sun Lake, even if you start with me, you'll get shipped out so fast you won't—" "Is that so?" she screamed. "Well, maybe you'd like to know that I can get all the love and respect I want around here, and where you got the nasty idea that I'm all interested in you, I can't imagine. I've heard of doctors like you before, and if you think you're going to get away with it, you're very much mistaken. And don't think I don't know all about you and that Willendorf woman. I know things people would love to hear." He walked off before she could say any more. God only knew what they'd do with her. Deport her, he supposed, and her sad sack of a husband would have to go too, and it would all be very messy and bad-tempered. Maybe Bell and Graham and all the others were right regarding Sun Lakers as anywhere from mildly insane to fanatically obsessed. Maybe anything at all, but he still had to go see Dorothy and her sinuses. The doctor's facial muscles fell into their accustomed neutrality as he walked into the girl's bedroom, and his mind automatically picked up the threads of the Becky Trayson story where he had left off 2 days before. Half an hour later, he was back at the unpacking and search operation, where he took over alone while Stillman, groggy with the strain, the responsibility, and the plain hard work, took a short break. The two of them divided the job then, moving steadily up and down the lines, checking, rechecking endlessly until, as darkness closed down, they were suddenly aware that there were no more crates. Mimi Johnson bitterly enumerated the results of the search. About 1,500 man-hours shot to hell, 3 crates contaminated beyond salvage, 9 salvageable for umpty hundred more man-hours, and no Marcane. Well, nobody can say now we didn't try. She turned to Tony. Your move, she said. Graham? The doctor stood up. All I can do is try to get him on our side. He's friendly, anyhow. He asked me to have supper with him out of his private stock of genuine synthetic earthside protein. You don't sound too hopeful, Gracie ventured. I'm not. Did I tell you what his favorite story is so far? Brownies. You mean he's passing up a yarn like The Killing at Pitco, and he wants to write about brownies? Nick asked incredulously. You think he's going to step on Pitco's toes? Tony retorted. Not that smart, boy. Okay, I might as well get back and make my try. He started across the darkening desert, and Nick fell into step beside him. Why don't you come along? The doctor suggested. Maybe you could talk his language better than I do. You might get a decent meal out of it, too. It's a thought. A good one. Only Marion's probably got supper already by now. I better check in at home first. I don't know. Would you say it was official council business? That's between you and your hunger, the doctor told him. What do you want most? Meat or Marion? Damned if I know, Nick admitted, grinning. Doc! It was Jim Candro running down the street toward them. Hey, Tony, I just came from the hospital looking all over. What's up? The baby. He's having convulsions. I'll go right over. Pick up my bag at the hospital, will you? Jim set off in one direction and Tony in the other. See you later, Nick called to the doctor's rapidly retreating back. At the Candros, he found Polly near hysterical, with a struggling infant in her arms. Sonny was obviously in acute discomfort. The veins were standing out on his fuzzy scalp. He was struggling and straining feebly. His belly was distended and his cheeks puffed out uncomfortably. How's he been eating? The doctor demanded, scrubbing his hands. The way you saw before, said Polly. Better and better, but just the way you saw before, wiggling and pushing, so half the time he was sucking on nothing at all. He was crying and crying, so I fed him 3 or 4 times, and each time he got more... She fell silent as Tony picked up the baby and patted and stroked it. It burped loudly. The alarming red color faded and the tense limbs relaxed. With a whimper, Sonny collapsed on the doctor's shoulder and fell asleep before he was back in his crib. But you said... Polly gasped. I guess Sonny didn't hear me, Tony said. Here you are, Doc. Jim came in and looked from Polly's empty arms to the quiescent baby in the crib. I guess he didn't need the bag. What was it? Colic, Tony grinned. Good old-fashioned earthside colic. But you told me... Jim turned accusingly on his wife. And I told Polly, Tony put in quickly. It doesn't usually happen. Babies don't have to be burped on Mars. Most of them, that is. The mask feeds richer air into the Mars baby's nose, so he just naturally breathes through his nose all the time and doesn't swallow air and get colic when he feeds. But I guess Sonny had his heart set on a bellyache. Was he crying when he fed, Polly? Why, yes, a little bit. Not really crying, a kind of whimper every now and then. And that could explain it. All right, now you know it isn't serious. Just be sure to bubble him after feeding. Thank the Lord he's nursing. That young man of yours gave us all a bad time, but I think we're out of the woods now. Sonny was going to be all right. For the first time, Tony really believed it. Somehow that changed the whole dismal picture. Tony entered his own house and found Graham still sitting in front of his typewriter. Not writing now, but reading through a pile of onion skin pages. Hi, I was waiting for you. The journalist looked pleased with himself. I'll fix up some sandwiches if you'll do something about that coffee of yours. When you make it, it's almost drinkable. There was a knock at the door. Come in, Tony called out. Oh, am I busting in on something? Nick asked innocently. No, of course not. Glad to see you. Doug, this is Nick Cantrella. I don't know if you met him before. He's in charge of maintenance and equipment in the lab and a member of our council. Nick, you know who Doug Graham is. Uh-huh, my rival. My wife's only true love. And you should see his wife, Tony added. This gets more and more interesting. You're not married to that lady pilot by any chance? Graham extended a greasy hand. No? Too bad. Join us. We're eating meat. Don't mind if I do. How's the baby, Tony? Anything really wrong? Yes and no. Colic. Good old colic, the doctor gloated. Shouldn't happen, but by God, it's something I know how to cope with. I think the kid's going to be all right. Coffee's ready. Where's the food? They munched sandwiches and had coffee, which Graham pronounced a very slight improvement over his own efforts. The two Sun Lakers were more than happy with it. It was sweetened with gratings from a brick of sugar produced by the Gunther from his wonder-packed luggage. The same suitcase turned out to hold another bottle of Earthside liquor, and Graham poured drinks all around. It's a celebration, the writer insisted, when Tony, remembering his hangover, would have demurred. I got a week's work done today. Full first chapter. Complete draft of the tripped out and impressions of Marsport. He fanned out a sheaf of pages, covered with single-spaced typing, and corked the bottle. Nick took a long, deep swallow, settled back blissfully on the bunk where he was sitting. Marcane, he said at last. I could explain it. What? I've been sitting here imagining I was eating meat and drinking whiskey. Can you beat that? He sipped more slowly this time, savoring the drink, and said determinedly to Graham, You're just about up to Sun Lake in your notes, then? That's right, Graham said. In the silence that followed, he asked brightly, Say, aren't you the guy who saw the brownie tracks? Brownie tracks? Who, me? You sure you weren't thinking of unicorns? Do unicorns leave footprints? Oh, that. Yeah, I saw something out in the caves in the Rimrock Hills. That's where the kids take the goats to graze. Are they allowed to go barefoot there? Graham asked. Allowed? Nick exploded. You haven't been 10 years old for quite some time, have you? How much attention do you think they pay? Quite a bit, Tony thought, remembering his talk with Tad, but he didn't bring it up. Out loud he said, I've got a theory about that. I've been thinking about it since last night, Doug. Maybe you can use it in your book. It wasn't smart, maybe, to keep riding the writer about it, but he'd had enough of brownies for a while. I'll tell you what I think. I think some kids who weren't supposed to do it went exploring in a cave, and one of them got lost. Then the rest wouldn't admit what happened, and all the search party could find was kid-sized footprints. So we have brownies, and a couple of dozen retired prospectors back on Earth are coining money telling lies about them. He finished more sharply than he meant to. I guess that squelches me, Graham laughed boisterously, picking up his papers, and stood up. I better get going, then. Have to find out about getting this stuff radioed out. He started for the door and almost collided with Anna coming in. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgot you had company, Tony. They kept me busy all day at the lab, and I thought maybe I could get some work done here this evening, but... She smiled apologetically at Tony and Nick, then turned to Graham. Were you going out? Shouldn't I? Of course not, said Tony. Not when Anna's just coming in. Stick around and you'll see something. What does she do? Graham asked. Song and dance routine? Prestidigitation? Nick said from his perch on the wall bunk, Graham, if you had an ounce of Earthside chivalry in your bloodstream, you'd uncork that bottle and offer the lady a drink. You're right. I'll even offer you one. Tony got another glass, and the writer poured. Then he turned to Anna and asked again, Well, what do you do? I'm a glassblower, that's all. Tony likes to watch it, and he couldn't possibly understand that other people might not enjoy it as much. Oh, you do your work over here? Yes, the doctor said testily. Anna is also my assistant, if you recall. Neither one is a full-time job, so she keeps her equipment here and combines the two. For a few minutes, the four of them sat talking inconsequentially, the three Sun Lakers answering Graham's endless variety of questions. Finally, Anna got up. If I'm going to get any work done, I'd better get started. She opened the cupboards and began pulling out equipment. Graham stood up too. Well, he picked up his sheaf of papers. Tony! All three men focused their attention on Anna, who stood facing them, her arms full of assorted junk. Tony, she said bluntly, have you told Mr. Graham about our problem here? Don't you think he might be able to help? Well, Graham sat down again and suddenly grinned. Tell me, what can I do for dear old Sun Lake? You can save our necks, Nick told him soberly. At least I think you can if you want to. You're going back on the rocket, he explained. And that rocket won't have our shipment on it because we didn't steal some Marcane we're accused of stealing. It's not here, so we couldn't find it, and that means Bell will throw a cordon around us on shipment day. You know Bell from way back. You could raise such a stink about what he's doing to us if he wanted to, that there'd be orders calling him to Earth on the next rocket that comes in. You're big enough to do it, and we don't know any other way." "You're very flattering," the writer said, "and also too damn brief. I already know that much. Suppose you fill me in on some of the details." "Bell tramped in 3 days ago," the doctor began carefully, and went through the story step by step, not omitting the information he'd picked up in Marsport, and reminding Graham at the same time about the Cham's new regulations against Marcane. "Brenner wants to get his hands on the Sun Lake lab," Tony wound up. "You got Bell kicked out of a good job once for crooked dealing, you could do it again. Unless Bell's got religion, and I see no sign of it, Brenner could easily hire him to kick us off Mars and then see that Brenner Pharmaceutical got the assets of the busted Sun Lake colony, including the lab, in a rigged auction." The writer pondered, and then told them slowly, "I think I can do something about it. It's a good story, anyhow. The least I can do is try." Nick let out a wild wahoo, and Tony slumped with relief. He looked back to Anna's workbench, smiling. But she was gone. "Now that that's settled," said Graham, "I want a favor myself." "Up to but not including my beautiful blonde wife," promised Nick fervently. "If it was women, I'd want that lady airplane pilot. But it isn't women. I still want to get this stuff filed to Marsport by your radio. I'm going to have a crowded schedule before takeoff, and every minute I clip off in advance, like getting this stuff typed and microfilmed, will help." "Sure, pal, sure." Nick stood up and shook the writer's hand earnestly. "I'll take you to the Radio Shack myself and give you the blanchest cart you ever saw."